Welcome to this new podcast series titled Talking Book Publishing with Steve and Tara. Hello, my name is Tara Brabazon.
My name is Steve Redhead.
And welcome to our second podcast in our series of The Book, How to Write a Book. And the second podcast, Steve, that I thought we'd talk about today is how do you know that it is time to write a book? So let's start, and you can start professionally or personally or emotionally, Steve, but when did you first realise that you wanted to write a book rather than merely read one?
I think it probably, when it really crystallised was when I was in my teenage years, and I did a lot of sport. I played a lot of sport, watched a lot of sport, and listened to a lot of music, and did a lot of things that seemed to be basically embracing popular culture, which at that time didn't seem to have much connection to the book. And I remember as a teenager at school being sort of encouraged, only did my parents encouraging me to make sure that I read books. And it wasn't just that I didn't read books. I think I did, but I had to be interested in the subject of that book. And I think that's when I really started to kind of fall in love with reading and then actually writing. And I've never lost that love of books, the actual idea of writing a book rather than maybe an article or a journalistic piece or whatever. It's still really important to me. And I think it's difficult to know, actually, whether you should put a particular project into a book form or a long article or a series of chapters in books or a series of podcasts, for that matter. The idea of the book is still perplexing to me, and I'm not sure that I can answer the question very easily. I think it just comes along. And for a while, I started to think, I won't write any more books. And then I wrote about 4 in 10 years. My last one was actually in 2011, came out in 2011. And I've had new projects in the last few years, which I thought would become books, but actually became series of articles, became series of chapters in books, series of talks. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I ever know when it's right to write a book.
What's interesting is I think you've captured there that the writing of a book is not an exact science, and I think we'll come back to that. But I think you've skipped over something very important there, because I think you've collapsed the reading into the writing. And I think for most people, for like 99% of the population who are readers, the notion of then taking that step and writing is an incredible step. Now, I think with you, because of your talent, because you are a wonderful writer, maybe that seemed more natural. But I'm thinking of my teenage years, and I can't remember ever thinking that I would write a book, or indeed write articles. I was known to be a good writer at school, but how that talent becomes something more sustained, I think is a great problem and a great paradox. Have you got any thoughts about that moment of when the reader becomes the writer?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in your background, your personal background, you come from an oral culture where people, and it's not just that it was Australia, it was an oral culture in your family where people talked around the kitchen table or wherever it was. And I didn't come from that at all. So I did come from a more literate and literary culture, and I felt that I would, if I was good enough, I would be able to write at some stage. So I didn't see that as alien to me.
That's very interesting, and of course, so there's that natural element to it, that movement of it. Your father was an academic, your father was a teacher, and many other things as well. But there were books in the house, and so there maybe is a naturalness to the movement. What I'd maybe say to listeners, though, is if you don't feel like there's a natural link between reading and writing, don't be worried, because I didn't either. I think it does depend on your background, your family,
Absolutely.
Your friends,
it's to do with culture.
Group. Absolutely. Now, this is a really funny question, because you've sort of said, look, I just sort of decided, I may write. But the funniest thing is your first book had an incredibly unusual history, and I've used unusual with multiple inverted commas. So can you tell us about your first book?
the first book I published was Sing When You're Winning, the last football book.
Yay.
And it was published eventually by Pluto Press. And
what year, Dale? What year did you write it?
It was written in 1984, 84-85, the time of effectively a civil war in the UK, created by the politics of the miners' strike. So that was the background to it, and it has a lot of that kind of background in the book, which is about football culture, but it's about the politics of football culture more than anything else. And I think what struck me at the time was that this was going to be such an almost impossible project. I mean, it came out originally out of my PhD, which took a long time to finish because I finished it part-time when I was in an academic job. And I couldn't get that published. I couldn't get the PhD published. This was 1984. I tried and tried and tried. And at some point, Pluto Press, who were a really funky publisher at the time, picked up the idea that they could transform the PhD thesis that I'd actually presented to them in such a way that it could become a popular book, and they were really hopeful for it. But in fact, Pluto Press went bust 3 times in the next 3 years before the book was published. And so when the book was published in 1987, the context was completely different. And I felt that I was getting shot down, certainly in the media, for writing a book which, was actually about an earlier period and captured really quite neatly an earlier period. And I think people started to appreciate that later. But also, it was an interesting publishing venture because it became not an academic thing, which was what the PhD was, but it kind of created debate about how you write about popular culture and sport at a particular time in the UK. And there weren't that many people doing that. There was, the old kind of sports journalists, sports reporters, and popular culture writers who were really from a completely different era. And I think the fault lines that I tried to set up with that book are still there. It's quite interesting that people still like it 30 years later. But I got absolutely battered at the time. People took to the radio and TV to really hammer me, as if it was... as if I was kind of supporting football hooliganism or something. It's crazy.
But I think, and the reason I think you were, attacked is also you were doing a hell of a lot in that book that was new. And you've picked up something there that I think ironically has categorised both of our careers, years before we even met each other and married and all the rest of it, in that how we write has been as much of significance to people as what we write, because we are working between the categories of what is academic work and what is popular cultural work. It's about the topic, but it's also about the form. And I think that's significant for academic colleagues that are listening to this podcast to think about too, about the mode through which you decide to express yourself.
Yeah, I think there are lots and lots of different modes. And one of the things about the digital revolution is that it's a lot easier now to develop modes for particular audiences. It wasn't back then.
So your first book, you tried to get your PhD published and couldn't. I tried to get my PhD published and couldn't, so that's interesting. What's significant is yours was still synergetic with the doctoral topic. My first book had nothing to do with my PhD at all. My first book, which was Tracking the Jack, a retracing of the Antipodes, was not written as a book, because I didn't know really I would ever have an opportunity of writing a book. It was written as a series of essays. At the time I thought I was an essayist. But the irony is I wrote about 8 essays on the same area of Australian, New Zealand, British relationships, and suddenly I realised, my God, I think there is actually a book there. So I put it together, aligned everything, wrote an introduction and conclusion, and I was very, very fortunate that I met an outstanding editor, Nicola Young, I'm very happy to mention her, at New South Wales University Press, UNSW Press, and she picked that out of 1,000 unsolicited monographs that would be on her desk. Literally, she picked it out and went, there is something here. Hadn't heard of me, no idea who I was. I was a young West Australian person at a West Australian university, very young, and she saw something. And I often think, Steve, and you and I have talked about this, if that editor hadn't seen something in that book, I'm not sure that everything that happened after Tracking the Jack would have actually occurred. It's about the courage, I think, of publishers. And you could be unlucky in your case or indeed lucky in mine. But we'll talk about publishers.
Yes, I think it is actually very important.
Yeah.
And those editors can make a tremendous difference. And that book, Sing When You're Winning, that I wrote, I owe Richard Cooper, who was the editor at Pluto Press, a great debt. And I know that he suffered personally and economically as a result of Pluto Press going down 3 times within a very short time. But actually, he took a chance on me, and I'm very grateful. Yeah,
and so that's the irony for guys and girls who are, got their first book. They need to, I think, remember that it's an incredible risk for a publisher. So when we're all grumble-bumming about publishers, I think we need to recognise we have to find someone with courage for that first time, because we are nobody going nowhere and nothing. And particularly for guys and girls that are not living in the UK and not living particularly in the United States, we're fighting multiple barriers to get through. Yeah. And so publishers that see something, I think we should really acknowledge and support them.
Yeah,
the final question for this How Do You Know It's Time to Write a Book, Steve podcast is asking you and thinking about the role of a book in an academic career. Now, that's probably not as simple a question as it appears. Let's talk about you and then talk about all the other colleagues that you've helped move through their career. What is the role of the book in developing an academic career?
Yeah, it is an interesting point, I think. I know lots of very good academics have actually not written books, not written a book. Yeah. But I think that it is very helpful if you're a young academic and that you're going to develop a long-term career to have books. You may not want to write as many as I've written, but certainly to write books is important. It's partly because it crystallises the ideas at a particular time, and people can look back on those 60, 70, 80,000 word projects many years later and still get stuff from them. But I think it also crystallises good ideas, innovative ideas at the time, and you can spread out in a book in a way that you can't in refereed articles of 8,000 words or something.
It is a real statement. It is for me like a full stop at the end of a paragraph, that we can do the outstanding teaching, the outstanding, I hope, management and leadership and mentoring others and all those other variables that are so important in academic life. But I always think a book is like the final sentence in a paragraph, which states, this is what all of this experience and expertise has meant. It's a real statement and conclusion and full stop, and it allows you, I think, to then move to the next stage of your life. There's always a sense, if you've got one of these big projects with multiple articles and PhD students, that it's almost not completed. A book is a real sense of it meant something. Do you feel that too?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it has that emotional investment and that investment of time and sacrifice, because you're spending time away from your family, away from all the other things that are much easier to do. But it is a statement that this time really mattered.
And it doesn't make money, mostly.
We'll get to the money shortly. Steve, thank you for podcast 2. We're done with 2. You ready for 3?
Ready.
Let's go. Thank you for listening to this podcast series on Talking Book Publishing with Steve and Tara. For further information, please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.